Have you ever wondered what happens when a predator finally realizes that they have been the ones being hunted all along? Most people assume that revenge is a loud, messy affair, filled with shouting matches, broken furniture, and dramatic goodbyes. But in my experience, the most effective justice is delivered in complete silence, across a polished mahogany dining table, while the air in the room is still heavy with the scent of expensive wine and false pretenses. The dining room in my daughter Sarah's home was supposed to be a place of warmth and family gatherings. That evening, however, it felt more like a courtroom waiting for a verdict. Sitting across from me were Richard and Eleanor, my daughters-in-laws. They were perfectly dressed as always. Eleanor wore a silk blouse that cost more than some people's monthly rent, and Richard had that practiced, easy smile that he used to convince people he was the pillar of the community. They were waiting for me to pull out a checkbook. For months, they had been pressuring me to contribute my life savings as a gift to help their son Mark and my daughter Sarah purchase a house in a gated community that was clearly outside of their means. They didn't see me as a father or a grandfather. They saw me as a target, a retired old man with a substantial nest egg just waiting to be harvested. I watched them closely, my hands resting calmly on my lap. They were so confident, so sure that I would cave to their social pressure. They had spent weeks telling me that my refusal to pay was selfish and unbecoming of a grandfather. They had used my love for my daughter as a weapon, hinting that if I didn't help, the young couple's marriage would suffer. But as I looked at them, I didn't feel anger. I felt nothing but a cold, clinical observation. Slowly, I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a single, thin manila folder. I placed it gently on the table and slid it across the surface. It made a soft, rasping sound against the wood, the only noise in the room. "Richard, Eleanor," I began, my voice steady and devoid of any emotion. "Before we discuss the finances for your son's new home, we need to take a look at the paperwork regarding your current business assets." The smile on Richard's face didn't vanish immediately. It froze, hanging there like a mask that had been glued on too tight. Eleanor looked at the folder with a confused frown, her hand hovering over it, but not quite touching the material. They were expecting a check, not an audit. They were expecting to be richer by the end of the night, not to be exposed. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I didn't lean forward to intimidate them. I simply sat back, took a slow sip of my water, and watched the realization begin to dawn in their eyes. They weren't looking at a bank draft. They were looking at a weapon. The air in the room seemed to thin out, the tension shifting from my refusal to pay into something far more dangerous for them. This wasn't a sudden reaction. It was the culmination of everything I had been building for the last 30 years. Most people looked at me and saw a retired senior living a quiet life in a comfortable house. They saw the gray hair, the slow movements, the hobbies of gardening and reading. They assumed I was out of touch with the modern world, perhaps a bit lonely, and definitely ready to be taken advantage of. They had no idea who I was before I retired. For 3 decades, I was a senior forensic accountant for the Department of the Treasury. I didn't carry a badge or a gun, but I carried something much more damaging to people who thought they were above the law. I carried the truth. My career was spent in the shadows of the financial world, dismantling complex Ponzi schemes, tracking money launderers, and finding the hidden assets that white-collar criminals thought they had successfully buried in the ether. I spent my days reading ledgers, tax filings, and property deeds like a detective reads clues at a crime scene. I learned early on that people can lie with their words, they can hide their faces, and they can craft perfect social personas, but they cannot hide from the numbers. Numbers are the only thing in this world that are truly honest. If you know how to read them, they will tell you exactly where a person has been, what they have done, and exactly how they have failed. When my daughter first introduced me to the Millers, I didn't look at them as family. I looked at them as a file that needed opening. It wasn't that I was suspicious by nature, though that helped. It was that I was observant. I noticed the way Richard always checked the price tags on menus, yet bragged about his investment properties that nobody ever seemed to visit. I noticed the way Eleanor spoke about charitable donations, but seemed terrified whenever the topic of her tax returns came up. People like that are predictable. They are always desperate, always reaching, and always assuming that everyone around them is too stupid to see through their facade. They didn't realize that by targeting me, they had invited a professional into their personal lives. They thought they were dealing with a generic, weak, and aging father-in-law who could be bullied into submission. They had no idea that I had spent my entire life taking down people far more dangerous and intelligent than them. I didn't just understand their game. I had written the rulebook on how to end it. The manipulation didn't start with a bang. It started with small, calculated whispers and subtle suggestions that grew louder over time. Richard and Eleanor were masters of the slow burn, carefully constructing an image of success that masked a rotting foundation. To the outside world, they were pillars of the community, the couple you would see at charity galas or country club luncheons. But in private, they were entirely hollow. My son-in-law, Mark, was a decent man, hard-working and genuine, but he had been conditioned since birth to fear his parents' disappointment. He was their primary conduit, the one they used to soften me up before the real demands began. At first, the requests were small. They would invite me over for dinner, and Eleanor would sigh about the unexpected costs of the social circuit, or how the stock market had temporarily tied up their capital. It was performance art. They were setting the stage, painting me as the wealthy retired father figure who had more money than he knew what to do with. They weren't just asking for money. They were framing it as a familial duty. They would talk about Sarah and Mark's future, their potential grandchildren, and how investing in the family name was the only responsible thing to do. They were using my love for my daughter as a blunt instrument. They knew Sarah wouldn't ask me for help herself, so they used her as a shield. They made it seem as if my reluctance to hand over my savings was the only thing standing between my daughter and a life of mediocrity. It was a classic gaslighting tactic. Make the target feel guilty for having boundaries, and then slowly dismantle those boundaries piece by piece. There were moments at those dinners where the facade would slip, just for a second. I remember one evening in late autumn, Eleanor was wearing a diamond necklace that looked like it belonged in a museum display. Yet she spent 20 minutes complaining about the high interest rates on a personal loan she claimed was for business expansion. My professional brain immediately flagged it. If you have the liquidity to afford five-figure jewelry, you don't complain about retail interest rates. It was a contradiction. Small, yes, but when you spend your life looking at spreadsheets, you learn that small contradictions are almost always the tip of a very large iceberg. Then came the co-signing request. This was the moment I knew they weren't just greedy, they were desperate. Richard pulled me aside after a Sunday brunch and produced a thick stack of documents. He wanted me to co-sign on a series of business loans for a new LLC he had just formed. He claimed it was a guaranteed investment, a surefire way to multiply my savings. He was sweating, just a little, and his eyes kept darting toward the door to make sure Mark wasn't listening. He didn't want a partner. He wanted a guarantor. He wanted someone with a clean credit history and a solid reputation to back his debt so he could keep playing the role of the wealthy entrepreneur. I looked at the documents, and I saw a disaster in the making. The LLC was registered to a shell company in a state known for its lax financial oversight, and the stated purpose of the business was vague at best. It was a classic setup for a loan default. I didn't say no right then. I took the papers home, smiled, and told him I'd review them. I had everything I needed to begin. Over the next few weeks, the pressure became constant. Eleanor would call Sarah, crying about unexpected financial burdens, and Sarah would come to me, looking pale and worried. It was a suffocating environment, one designed to wear me down until I simply surrendered to make the noise stop. They pushed me into a corner, assuming that a man of my age would be too tired or too intimidated to fight back. They thought they could bully me into financing their lifestyle, paying off their hidden debts, and effectively gambling my retirement on their incompetence. They made me feel like an outsider in my own family, as if my refusal to part with my money was an act of betrayal. Every time they asked, I watched. I watched the way they looked at their home, as if they were already preparing to leave it. I watched the way Richard checked his phone every 5 minutes, his movements erratic and tense. I saw the patterns. They were drowning, and they saw me as the life raft. But what they didn't know was that while they were busy building a cage for me to walk into, I was busy gathering the lumber to burn that cage to the ground. I wasn't just paying attention to what they said. I was paying attention to what they didn't say. I was looking for the gaps, the missing entries, the dates that didn't align with their stories. They thought they were playing a game of social chess, but they were playing it with someone who had spent decades mastering the board. They were the ones being set up, and they didn't even have the sense to realize it. I was just waiting for the right moment to make my first move, and by the time they realized what I was doing, it would already be far too late for them to run. Once they left my home that night, the performance stopped. I didn't pace the floor or lose sleep over their threats. Instead, I went straight to my home office, turned on my desk lamp, and sat down in front of my computer. This was my sanctuary. For 30 years, this had been my battlefield, not with swords or fists, but with numbers, dates, and signatures. I didn't need to break any laws to dismantle the Millers. In the United States, everything leaves a trail. If you know how to look, you can find the skeleton of anyone's life buried in public records, and the Millers had left enough breadcrumbs to fill a library. I started with the basics. I didn't need to hack into secure servers or perform illegal wiretaps. All of the information I needed was public, just hidden behind layers of bureaucracy that most people are too lazy or intimidated to navigate. I pulled up the county property records first. Richard had been telling everyone that he owned a construction firm with multiple high-value commercial contracts. A simple search of the property deeds in our county and the neighboring ones told a different story. I cross-referenced the business addresses listed on his website with the actual ownership records of the buildings. Every single one was leased under a commercial management company that Richard had no connection to. Next, I dug into the court dockets. I searched for his name, his wife's name, and every variation of the LLCs they had tried to get me to co-sign for. It didn't take long to find the pattern. In the last decade, there had been 3 separate bankruptcies filed under different company names, all linked to the same address. Each one had been liquidated, leaving behind a trail of unpaid vendors and angry creditors. They weren't entrepreneurs. They were professional ghosts. They would start a company, extract what they could, siphon the assets into personal accounts, and then let the business fail when the bills came due. It was a classic cycle of corporate malfeasance, and they had been getting away with it for years because they chose small-time targets who didn't know how to look past the surface. The most damning piece of evidence, however, was in the donor databases and public filing records for their so-called charitable contributions. They were claiming tax deductions for massive donations to foundations that didn't exist or were mere fronts for private accounts. It was a flagrant violation of IRS guidelines. I spent hours tracing the flow of money. I found a recurring series of consulting fees being paid out of their business accounts to an offshore shell company in the Cayman Islands. They were laundering their own debt, moving money from one pocket to another to create the illusion of liquidity. It was sloppy, it was arrogant, and it was all perfectly documented, sitting right there in the digital ether, waiting for someone with the right eyes to find it. I kept a meticulous ledger of my own. I wasn't just collecting information, I was building a case. I used highlighters to map out the connections, drawing lines between the dates of their business failures and the dates of their luxury vacations. The timeline was sickeningly consistent. Every time they were on the verge of financial collapse, they would manufacture a crisis to squeeze more money out of people like me. I created folders for every document I downloaded. I organized them by date, by transaction type, and by legal significance. I made sure every file was backed up in 3 different locations. The quiet of the night was my only companion. While they were probably in their kitchen, laughing about how they had almost convinced me to part with my money, I was methodically dismantling their entire existence. I felt a cold sense of satisfaction. This wasn't about the money they wanted from me. It was about the principle of the thing. They had underestimated me because they judged me by my age and my quiet demeanor. They thought they could use me. Instead, they had handed me the keys to their own destruction. I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a technician at work. There is a specific kind of clarity that comes when you stop reacting to people and start analyzing them. I stopped seeing them as my daughters-in-laws and started seeing them as a balance sheet that didn't add up. Every discrepancy, every lie, and every fraudulent transaction was just another piece of evidence. By the time the sun began to peek over the horizon, I had everything I needed. I had a complete forensic map of their deception. They weren't just going to lose the money they were trying to steal from me. They were going to lose the facade they had spent their entire lives building. They were going to lose everything, and they wouldn't even see it coming until it was far too late to do anything about it. The invitation was simple. I told them I had made my final decision regarding their request. It was the bait they had been waiting for. When they arrived that evening, their demeanor was different. They were no longer begging. They were acting as if the money was already theirs. Eleanor walked through my door like she was inspecting a property she was about to purchase. Richard had the look of a man who had already spent the cash on a new car or a membership fee. They sat at my dining table with an air of entitlement that was, quite frankly, fascinating to watch. They didn't see the man who had spent his life investigating fraud. They saw a Mark who had finally folded. I didn't rush. I made sure we had a full meal. We talked about the weather, their social calendar, and the exciting opportunities they claimed to be building for my daughter and son-in-law. It was a dark, ironic performance. I listened to their lies with the patience of a stone. Every word they spoke about their fake business success, every claim of impending profit, was just more evidence for my internal case file. I waited until the plates were cleared and the wine was finished. When the room went quiet, I didn't reach for a checkbook. I reached for the manila folder. I placed it on the table. It wasn't a thick stack, but it was heavy with the truth. I looked at them, and for the first time that night, I didn't smile. My expression was blank, professional, and entirely detached. I told them that before we discussed the transfer of my retirement funds, we needed to clear up a few inconsistencies in their own financial records. Richard chuckled. He thought it was a joke. He told me there was no need to be formal. I didn't join his laughter. I simply opened the folder to the first page. I didn't start with their greed. I started with their incompetence. I pointed to a document that showed the ownership structure of the LLC they had asked me to co-sign. I walked them through the registration details, the state of incorporation, and the curious trail of money leading to the Cayman Islands. I spoke in the language of an auditor. I didn't use angry words. I used facts, dates, and account numbers. I watched the color drain from Richard's face as I listed the specific bankruptcies he had filed under various names. I could see the moment the arrogance left his eyes. It was replaced by a slow, creeping realization that he wasn't sitting across from a tired old man anymore. He was sitting across from a predator who knew exactly where the bodies were buried, or, in this case, where the money was laundered. Eleanor tried to interrupt. She started to stammer, her voice rising in a desperate attempt to regain control of the narrative. She called me confused, saying I had misread the documents. I didn't let her finish. I turned to a different page, one that detailed the charitable donations they had claimed on their taxes. I showed them the breakdown of those funds, tracing the money from the donor database directly back to their personal checking accounts. It was a clear, unambiguous case of tax fraud. The room became suffocatingly quiet. The sound of the clock on the wall seemed to get louder with every heartbeat. I watched them crumble. It is a strange thing to witness, the collapse of a person's pride. They were so busy projecting an image of wealth and sophistication that they had never considered what would happen if someone actually peeled back the curtain. They had spent their lives assuming that people would be blinded by their confidence, but confidence is a poor shield against reality. I told them exactly what would happen if these files were sent to the authorities. I wasn't making a threat. I was stating a fact. I described the investigation that would follow, the auditing of their entire financial history, and the inevitable legal consequences for the fraud they had committed. Richard tried to stand up, but his legs seemed weak. He sat back down, his eyes fixed on the documents in front of him. He wasn't looking for a way to negotiate. He was looking for an exit. Eleanor was silent, her hands gripped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. The power dynamic in the room had shifted entirely. They were no longer the predators. They were the prey, caught in a trap of their own making. I watched them sweat, watched the fear take hold of them, and for the first time in months, I felt completely at peace. The hunt was over, and the outcome had been decided long before they even walked through my door. They had come here to take my money, but they were leaving with something much heavier, the terrifying truth that their entire world was about to fall apart. The silence in the room after the confrontation was deafening. Richard looked at me, not with anger, but with the hollow gaze of a man who had finally realized his armor was made of glass. He didn't try to negotiate. He didn't try to threaten me, because he knew that any threat would only accelerate the timeline of his own destruction. He looked at Eleanor, who was staring blankly at the tabletop, and then back at me. He was waiting for the blow to fall, but I had already delivered it. I didn't want to be the reason for their public ruin. That would have only caused my daughter more pain. I wanted them gone, removed from our lives like a tumor that had been carefully excised. I gave them a choice, simple and cold. I told them they had 48 hours to begin liquidating their assets. I didn't care what they sold or how much they lost in the process. They had to settle their debts, clear out of the state, and disappear from my daughter's life entirely. If they tried to contact Sarah or Mark, or if they tried to maintain even a shred of their charade, the folder on my table would be hand-delivered to the nearest FBI field office. They didn't ask for a second chance. They didn't ask for mercy. They simply stood up, pushed their chairs in, and walked out of my house. The front door closed with a click that sounded like the final period at the end of a long, exhausting sentence. The following weeks were a surreal exercise in watching a slow-motion collapse. I didn't have to lift a finger. The weight of their own lies did the work for me. They sold their home, their luxury cars, and their status symbols, one by one. It was as if a vacuum had been turned on, sucking the false prestige right out of their existence. To the rest of the world, it looked like a sudden shift in priorities, a decision to downsize. But I knew exactly what it was: an evacuation. They moved 2 states away, settling into a small rented apartment where they couldn't afford to pretend to be anything other than what they were. The hardest part was helping Sarah understand. She had been trapped in their orbit for years, conditioned to see their toxicity as normal. I didn't dump all the evidence on her at once. That would have been cruel. Instead, I sat her down and told her the truth about the choices they had made. I explained that I had uncovered a pattern of behavior that was dangerous for her and Mark. I saw the heartbreak in her eyes, the moment she realized that the people she had tried so hard to please had been using her as a pawn all along. But I also saw the relief. It was like watching someone take off a heavy coat they hadn't realized they were wearing. Mark, for his part, finally found the spine he had been missing. He saw the shift in his parents, the way they retreated and hid, and he finally understood that their greed had been the anchor dragging them both down. He stopped being the child who feared their judgment and started being the man who protected his own life. There is a lesson here, one that I have carried with me through all my years of forensic work. People spend their lives building these elaborate facades, constructing towers of debt and lies, assuming that if they just reach high enough, they'll never have to look down at the foundation. They think that as long as they can keep the illusion moving fast enough, no one will notice the rot underneath. But greed is a blinding force. It makes you assume that everyone else is as desperate, as hungry, and as dishonest as you are. They looked at me and saw a piggy bank. They saw a target they thought was too slow, too old, and too soft to fight back. They never stopped to consider that I had been trained to see the numbers behind the story. In the end, I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to engage in a messy public battle. I didn't need to be the hero of a dramatic story. I just needed to let them do the talking while I did the math. The truth doesn't require volume to be heard. It is a quiet, steady presence that eventually balances itself out. It is like a well-kept ledger. Everything eventually accounts for itself. The Millers wanted to live in a world where money mattered more than integrity, and in that world, they lost everything. Peace is often an expensive thing to buy, but looking at my daughter's face today, knowing she is finally free from that shadow, I can say it was worth every single cent. Life has a way of settling the score, and sometimes you don't even have to be the one to pick up the pen. You just have to be the one to make sure the final entry is written correctly. Justice is rarely a loud event. It is the quiet, calm reality that remains once all the noise and deception have been cleared away.